Okay, this video is an intro to Unit 5, which is about Judaism. This is a quick little, I say quick, it's a half hour long, but it's condensing into half an hour what I would normally take a whole class period in the classroom to cover. If you don't have time to sit down for a full half hour, I don't know, break it up and watch it in two parts. But it is a really important intro where I try to hit on a bunch of the key ideas about the Jewish religion and what is covered in chapter 6 of your textbook. The chapter on Judaism, Unit 5, Chapter 6 in the textbook. And I want to go over in this just some of the key ideas that are going to come up in your textbook questions and in your worksheets, and the things that are kind of a basis to understand before you go diving into the assignments in this unit. So I would recommend that either before or after reading the chapter, probably before, and certainly before you get into doing any of the assignments, you take a half an hour, treat it as a class period, and watch this video of me kind of taking you through some notes on key ideas in this chapter, key concepts in Judaism. So this is an intro to Unit 5 in World Religions. If you've been doing the whole course from the beginning, you've done 3101, you've done the first 4 units, and now we're beginning the second course, which is basically just the last 4 units. If you are new to the course and you're just starting at midpoint through, then this is your first unit, but we call it Unit 5 because it's the 5th one that we've covered. So we're going to look at a world religion known as Judaism. So one of the things when we look at world religions is sometimes we kind of ask, how do we determine which world religions we're going to cover in a world religions course? And usually it goes by what we call major religions in terms of size. In terms of how many people practice it. So, Christianity, 2 billion people. Islam, over 1 billion. Hinduism, probably about 1 billion. You're looking at a lot of people worldwide who practice those religions. Of the major world religions that we study in the course, Judaism is by far the smallest. There are fewer than 17 million Jews worldwide. There are a lot of religions that we don't count as or consider major that have more people following them than Judaism. So why do we consider Judaism one of the major world religions, and why is it important that it takes up a unit in our course? Well, let's talk about that. So Jews, and by the way, just a word about terminology here. The religion is called Judaism. For people who practice Judaism or who identify it as their cultural background, the noun is Jew, and the adjective is Jewish. And we usually refer to someone who practices Judaism or who identifies with Judaism as Jewish, being Jewish, or a Jewish person. So although there are not a lot of Jewish people in the world, they have had over the centuries and the millennia a major interest on the thought and culture of the Western world, which is why, because of their historical impact, the religion is considered major, despite the fact that it's small in size. There are 2 much larger world religions that we're going to look at later in this course, the next 2 units, Christianity and Islam, and both of those have their roots in Judaism. Both of those are outgrowths. They have gone in different directions, but they kind of start from the same roots as Judaism. And sometimes, for reasons that we'll see in a few moments, all 3 of those are referred to as the Abrahamic religions. So this is a diagram of a tree, and when I have people in class and I'm going over this, sometimes I draw a tree diagram on the board, but I decided for this year, since some of you would be in class and some of you would be watching this online, I would just, put up a slide of a tree, because it turns out I draw trees really, really badly. But this diagram, very simple diagram of a tree and its roots, I kind of want to use to illustrate the relationships among these 3 religions. And like I said, the other 2 we're going to come back to in the next 2 units. But when we talk about ancient Judaism, the religion of the first people who identified themselves as, well, first they were called Hebrews, and then later the term came to be Jews, and how they practiced that for a couple of thousand years. That's what we sometimes call ancient Judaism, and it forms the roots of this religion and the trunk of it, the basis of the practice that was carried on for thousands of years. You could look at that trunk as continuing into a main branch that I've kind of indicated as the branch that goes straight up from the trunk, which is modern Judaism, which grows directly out of these roots and trunks. So when we're looking at Jewish history in this unit, we're talking about the roots and how they lead into the modern day practice of Judaism. But then you also look at Christianity as a branch that kind of goes off to the side, because about 2,000 years ago, a Jewish guy named Jesus basically collected some followers, and his followers eventually, after a couple of generations, decided they were not just a special group of Jews who believed certain things. They were actually a whole separate religion. And so Christianity went and branched off and became its own religion. And then you also have a second branch in Islam, which is the religion we're going to look at in Unit 7, which about 1400 years ago, it wasn't so much that a group of Jews broke away, as happened with Christianity, but rather that a group of people who had just been kind of practicing their indigenous religion started studying, and it wasn't even a group of people so much as one person in the case of Islam, but we'll get to that, started studying the teachings of Jews and Christians, and were like, hey, this is also part of our heritage, and we're going to build our beliefs upon it. So you have these two newer and, in terms of numbers, much larger religions, Christianity and Islam, both coming off that common branch and common root of ancient Judaism and forming today three different religions: Christianity, Islam, and the one we're going to focus on in this unit, which is Judaism. So what ties all three of these religions together and what they have in common, and they also have it in common with the fourth religion that we're going to study in this part of the course, Sikhism, but we'll talk about that and the connections later. But when we look at what we sort of consider like the main three monotheistic religions, Judaism, the root, Christianity and Islam, the branches that came off it, what they have in common is that they are all what we call monotheistic religions. And we've talked already in this course about how polytheism means believing in many different gods. Monotheism means believing in only one. Atheism, believing in no God at all. So monotheistic religions say there is only one God. And as far as we know, the ancient Hebrews, which is the original name for the people who developed the religion of Judaism, they were the first major group of people that we know of in history to practice monotheism. Almost all ancient religions, indigenous religions, are to some degree polytheistic. As we've seen with Aboriginal spirituality and as we've seen with Hinduism, they may believe there is like one great spirit over all, but it's identified through many different gods and goddesses and spirits. And Judaism kind of abandoned all of that and said, no, there is just the one God. We don't worship a whole bunch of different gods and goddesses. We don't make statues and images and pray to all these different gods and goddesses. We worship the one God, and that's the right way to worship. And along with that came the idea that not only were they not worshiping the many different gods of the neighboring cultures and people around them, but they also, even of their own God, the God they identified as being the one God, they would not make any images or statues or pictures. So in a culture where, most people did not have a written language and visual images were really important, so people made carvings and sculptures and statues and paintings of the gods that they worshipped, the early Hebrews were different. They said, no, our God cannot be seen or depicted or made into any kind of statue or image. And there's actually, you still see this today. If we were doing a normal semester without COVID, when we could have our regular lives and be doing field trips, one of the things I would be doing would be taking you just down the road, just around the corner from the Murphy Center on Elizabeth Avenue, to the very small Jewish synagogue in St. John's. And if you visit a Jewish house of worship, which is called a synagogue, anywhere today, one thing you'll notice is that you don't see any images of God. You don't see, and you usually don't see images of people either. You don't see like stained glass, images of the saints or statues like you might see in a Hindu temple that people would bring offerings to. No images, no visual representations of God whatsoever in a Jewish synagogue, because God is supposed to be, the God of Judaism is beyond seeing and representing. So the idea of one God who cannot be seen or represented as an image was passed on to Christianity and to Islam. And in Christianity, it takes a slightly different form because, of course, Christian churches often do have a lot of images, and they will, have images of Jesus. And if it's a Catholic church, maybe the saints or Jesus' mother, Mary. You still don't tend to get, though, in a Christian church, an image of God himself, God the Creator. And in Islam, in mosques, it's even more extreme because they don't allow any images of any human figures whatsoever, and sometimes not even any animal figures, because the idea is we don't try to represent living or sentient things at all in Islam. So Islamic art is full of images of like flowers and fruit and geometric designs, but you don't see human figures in it. And all that comes from the original Jewish teaching, which in the Ten Commandments says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. In other words, you shan't engrave or carve an image of the God that you worship. So when we talk about Judaism, we talk about history. And historical events and historical people are very important in the story of Judaism. Remember how when we talked about Eastern religions, this is for those of you who did 3101. I know those of you who are doing just 3106 are kind of coming in cold to this. But for those who did the units on Hinduism and Buddhism, we talked about how people in Eastern Asian cultures often tend to represent time as a circle, and there's reincarnation and everything goes around and around and around. Whereas we in the Western world tend to see time more as a line or an arrow moving forward, whether that's our individual lives or world history or whatever. And that is kind of in line with the Jewish way of thinking, that things happen in history, they have an impact, they matter, and God is able to act and intervene throughout history to bring about a certain desired result. So the stories of Judaism are really important. Now, some Jews today, particularly some very, sort of more modern, and we'll talk about Reform Jews later, may not believe, especially the older stories, may not believe all of them absolutely literally, but they would still say the stories are very important in representing how God works throughout our history. So the founder of the Hebrew nation, and this is one of these stories that's so far back that we really don't know how much is historical and how much is legendary, but the founder of the Hebrew nation, according to the Jewish sacred texts and scriptures, was a guy called Abraham, who may have lived around 2000 BCE. Again, we really don't know because we're going back to pretty early history here, and Abraham, as he's depicted in the stories, was like a nomad who, just like nomads in many parts of the world today, moved around from place to place. So it's not like there'd be a lot of written record of his existence, even if we knew for sure that when he did live. But all the Jewish stories trace back to this founder of the nation, Abraham. And this is why Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are all known as the three Abrahamic religions, because they all claim to be descended, not necessarily descended by blood, but descended in terms of beliefs and traditions from this guy, Abraham. And then another key figure is Moses. That's actually not Moses. That's Charlton Heston playing Moses in a famous movie called The Ten Commandments from the 1950s. But Moses is another one of the great leaders and great founding stories of Judaism. And in fact, one of your assignments in this unit is going to be to watch a kids movie called The Prince of Egypt about the story of Moses leading his people out of slavery and to freedom. And we think that Moses, again, we don't know how historical this story is or how much of it is legend. We think it may have happened around 1200 BCE, so that would be about 3,200 years in the past. Again, I'll remind you, if anybody, as we're looking into these next couple of units, is confused about how we measure time and what we mean by BCE and CE, I do have a video on that I made for my socials class last year. So please, by all means, let me know if you need that link. If you're like, I don't really understand what you're talking about when you're talking about 1200 BCE. I can explain that. So Moses emerged to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt and to found their own nation. And we associate Moses with the Torah, the sacred text. The Jews have their most holy text is what's called the 5 books of Moses. If you know the Christian Bible at all, the first part of the Christian Bible is the same as the Jewish scriptures, and the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are the books of the Torah, and that is the most sacred text in Judaism. And within that is the kind of central piece of Jewish law, which is called the Ten Commandments. And the story goes that Moses went up into a mountain and God gave him the 10 Commandments, like written on 2 stone tablets, and he brought them down and told the people, this is how you're supposed to live. So that's one of the great sort of foundational stories of Judaism. Another key point to know about Judaism is that it is very closely tied in to the land, to the territory of the land called Israel, which was the traditional Jewish homeland. This is just a very, very close-up map that shows the nation of Israel and the countries around it. Egypt over here, Jordan over here, Syria up here. That's the Mediterranean Sea over there. So if you know what a world map looks like, or are good at finding things on a world map or a globe, if you find the Mediterranean, you should be able to spot Israel just over on the side of it. It's quite a small country for the impact it's had on world history, much like the actual numbers of Jewish people are quite small for the impact that they've had on world history and culture. But the idea of being Jewish and Judaism, the religion, is also very closely tied to this homeland. Jewish sacred texts say that this was the homeland that was established after Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt. So the people were slaves. They had been enslaved by the Egyptians, which was the most powerful empire in the world at the time. Moses led basically a slave rebellion, a slave uprising, led his people out of Egypt. And this general territory here is the land that they occupied and founded and became their homeland. There was a brief time after that, brief in terms of human history, a few hundred years, when the nation of Israel was an independent kingdom. But again, being such a small country surrounded by bigger, more powerful empires, they didn't last long in independence. They were forced into exile. This is condensing a very long and complicated story, which is told in a bit more detail in your textbook, but I'm just trying to hit some of the high points here. They were forced into exile by the Empire of Babylon in the 500s BCE, spent some years, a couple of generations in exile, and then returned, some of them, to reestablish their capital city at Jerusalem several decades later. And it's thought that much of what makes up the Jewish scriptures, their sacred texts, were either written during this time that they were exiled in Babylon, or were collected at that time from older traditions. So the idea is that these people were in exile. They were not able to live out their normal life and worship at their temple in Jerusalem, which had been destroyed and all that. So instead they turned to their sacred texts. And we're going to see the same thing happening again several hundred years later when they're once again driven out of their homeland. So the nation of Israel, after the Babylonian exile, they were conquered and ruled by different powerful empires. This was the age of empires. For those of you who've done any history study, and particularly if you know anything from Socials 2201, 2202, this was when the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and eventually the Roman Empire were rising to power. And eventually the nation of Israel was conquered by the Roman Empire. Like lots of people, they were not super happy about being conquered, and they kept having rebellions and rising up against the Romans. In 70 CE, so this is 1900 and a bit years ago now, the Romans crushed a Jewish rebellion, and they basically said over the next decades, we're going to put a stop to this problem of Jewish rebellion entirely. We're going to exile these people from their own land. We are going to drive them out. They're not allowed to live in their own country anymore. And for the next 2,000 years, very, very few Jews lived in the land of Israel, in their traditional homeland. 1948, so that was just over 60 years ago, the state of Israel became a Jewish state again. And the process of how that happened is way outside the scope of what we have time to talk about in this class. But, it's enough to say that it was a long, hard battle to get there. And there has continued to be a lot of conflict between the nation of Israel and its neighboring countries and some of the non-Jewish people within its own borders. It's still an area of the world where there's a lot of conflict and sometimes violence. But since 1948, Israel has been a majority Jewish state, and a lot of Jewish people from other parts of the world have gone and migrated and settled in Israel to kind of have their Jewish homeland there. There's still a lot of Jews outside of Israel who've never lived there and live in other countries. There's Jewish populations in Canada and the US, all over the world. But there is once again now a Jewish homeland in Israel for the past 60 plus years. As we go through this little very brief look at Jewish history, one of the things you probably notice is, went into exile in first enslaved in Egypt, went into exile in Babylon, driven out of their country by the Romans and went into exile. Jewish people have suffered as a people hardship and persecution throughout history. And on the one hand, this is pretty common because unfortunately, humans being what we are, hatred and violence between different groups of people is unfortunately kind of a feature of all human societies. You know, we are good at being bad to each other. But specifically, Jewish people have been targeted for this kind of hate so often that there's in fact a specific word for anti-Jewish hate. Hatred of Jewish people is known as anti-Semitism. For nearly 2,000 years after the Romans forced the Jews out of Israel, beginning in 70 CE, Jewish people were a minority in other people's countries. They were a minority group throughout Europe and much of the Middle East and North Africa. They lived, you know, in other people's culture, but they kept to their own religion, their own traditions, sometimes even kept their own language, spoke a separate language. And unfortunately, again, human nature being what it is, anytime you have a minority group that is easy to pick out and identify as different, it tends to make them a target for hate. There's also a religious aspect to this. Christianity, again, grew out of Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. But once Christianity not only became its own religion, but eventually became the dominant, the majority religion in Europe, the religion that had all the power, Christian churches and rulers often singled the Jews out for hatred and for attacks. So rather than saying, you know, let's honor and respect these people because our leader came from them and many of our traditions and heritage come from Jews, they kind of did the opposite, turned on the Jews and said, well, because you didn't accept Jesus as your Savior and Lord, we're going to persecute you and we're going to drive you out. We're going to put all kinds of restrictions on how you can live. We're going to take away your basic rights. And in many cases, we're going to attack and kill you. So there's quite a long and tragic history over the last 2,000 years of Jewish people being persecuted and treated very badly and having their rights denied simply for being a religious minority and a cultural minority in other people's territories. And of course, most of you have probably learned about the Holocaust, as it's often called, in school or just through popular culture. Anti-Semitism reached its most terrible level quite recently. You know, the most horrific of these things did not happen 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. It happened 70 to 80 years ago during the Second World War in the 20th century, when as many as 6 million European Jews were targeted for mass execution in Nazi death camps. I mean, if you know anything about Hitler and the Nazis, you know there's a lot of people they were not good to, and a lot of people died under Nazi regimes, but they targeted Jews out for special hatred and special attacks, and eventually for what they called the final solution, which was the idea that they would kill all Jews in Europe. And while they didn't do that, they didn't succeed in that, it's thought that during the Second World War, about 2/3 of the Jews in Europe, about 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe were killed either directly or indirectly in the Nazi death camps or through various purges and acts that the Nazis carried out. So that's, you know, that's a pretty heavy history for Jewish people to carry, and it's a pretty heavy history for the rest of us non-Jews to look at as an example of what people will do to people that they identify as being different in any way. So let's take a look at modern Judaism. So we go back again to 70 CE when the Jews were forced out of Israel, out of the land of Israel. And just as had happened 500 years earlier in the exile in Babylon, it meant that they no longer had their temple at Jerusalem. The temple, which was the second or third temple built on that site, had been destroyed again. And it was no longer the focus of Jewish worship and leadership like it had been for hundreds of years. And so instead, the center of Jewish life became the synagogue. And synagogues were places of worship, kind of like Christian churches, but they were also a bit like schools in that they were seen as places where usually Jewish men, could gather together to study the law, study and discuss and debate about the sacred text. So there's a lot of emphasis on reading, learning, study, and discussion in Judaism. And synagogue communities were and are led not by priests and holy men, but by teachers who are known as rabbis. And there's an artistic representation of a Jewish rabbi in a kind of very traditional garb and outfit. If you're wondering why he has like a box on his forehead, it's because part of a traditional dress for many Jews is a little tiny box like that, which again, the average person wouldn't wear, but that a rabbi in the synagogue might, which has a tiny portion of the Torah, of the sacred text in it. And that's because there actually is a text in the Torah that says, God says to the people, remember my words and bind them into your forehead. And of course it means metaphorically, you know, keep them in your memory, but some Jews will literally wear a little packet of the Torah on their forehead as a memorial, as a reminder. And he's reading there from a scroll, which represents the scroll of the Torah. So the idea of reading, study, learning, and discussion became very, very central to Jewish life after the Romans forced them into exile. And because these communities and synagogues were led by rabbis, the form of Judaism that's developed over the last 2,000 years is often called rabbinic Judaism, Judaism as led by rabbis. It's focused on the study and practice of Jewish law as taught in, and there are 3 levels of kind of sacred text within Judaism: the Torah, those 5 most holy books that are supposed to have come from Moses himself; the Tanakh, which makes up the rest of, again, if you look at a Christian Bible and you look at the part called the Old Testament, that's the Torah and Tanakh, that's the Jewish scriptures; and then the Talmud, which is a collection of basically commentaries and discussion by different rabbis about Jewish law, which doesn't necessarily all agree with each other. Sometimes it includes debates and disagreements about what a particular piece of the law might mean, that was written and collected over a period of hundreds of years. So there's a lot of focus, like I said, on learning, study, discussion, and on understanding and interpreting the law. Many people will say that Rabbinic Judaism is a religion that is more about doing than about believing. It's not so much about what you believe about God, it's how you live, it's how you practice that belief, is the heart of Judaism. Like all religions, Judaism has many different branches and groups within it. The main ones, and you have this is in your textbook, and you're going to have a worksheet on it in your worksheets. The main ones are, first of all, the Orthodox. The Orthodox Jews are the most traditional. An Orthodox Jewish service will be in Hebrew, in the old traditional language, not in the everyday language that people speak. In the synagogue, men and women will sit separately, and the Torah, the law, is believed to have been given directly by God, spoken directly into the ears of Moses. Within the Orthodox, there is a smaller subgroup of people who are almost like super Orthodox. They are called the Hasidim, or Hasidic Jews, and they have their own sort of history and traditions coming from Europe in, I think, the 18th century maybe, but they're often recognizable by the fact that not only are they very, very strictly tradition and tend to live in kind of separate little communities, they're often also recognizable by specific clothing. If you see pictures of, or even see in real life, Jewish men with like black coats and broad brim black hats and kind of wearing long curly locks of hair by their ears and often bearded, those are usually Hasidic Jewish men. That's part of kind of their traditional dress, traditional costume. On the sort of other end of the spectrum from from Orthodox, you have the Reform Jews. They are much less traditional. They blend Jewish tradition with modern culture and society. They don't necessarily follow all the Jewish traditions. There's a lot of rules within Judaism, for example, about what you can and can't eat, what you can and can't do on the Sabbath day, how you observe all kinds of different festivals and rituals. Reform Jews would not necessarily follow all of those. Reform Jews would certainly have not only men and women sitting together in the synagogue, but they were the first to allow women to be rabbis, which Orthodox still don't do. In between the Orthodox and the Reform, you have a group that is kind of a middle way that's known as conservative. So they're not as traditional as the Orthodox. They don't have their services in Hebrew. They speak in English, or, you know, if you're in a French-speaking country, in French, whatever. They speak in the common language of the people. They would have men and women sitting together. Nowadays, conservatives can have women rabbis, although Orthodox still don't. And conservative, that kind of middle road, middle way, is the most common form of Judaism in Canada. The majority of Canadian Jews worship at conservative synagogues, and the only Jewish synagogue here in St. John's is a conservative synagogue. Interesting to note, by the way, again, I feel bad that we don't get to do the field trip on this, but the Jewish community here in Newfoundland, especially in St. John's, very, very small, only a handful of families. They have a tiny building. They probably don't even fill that up for a worship service because there's just not a lot of Jewish people in St. John's. And so we're talking about a very tiny community. But it is a conservative synagogue. And there is also here in St. John's an Orthodox, I think they might even be Hasidic, Jewish rabbi and his wife and family who have lived and settled here. And they, at least a couple of years ago, I don't know if this is still true, but the person who gave us the tour of the synagogue a couple of years ago said that Orthodox Jewish family, who I think are maybe from Montreal, won't worship at the synagogue, at the conservative synagogue, because they allow men and women to sit together and worship. And so it's too liberal, it's too relaxed, it's not traditional enough for them. So even within tiny religious communities like the Jewish community here in St. John's, there can be divisions and disagreements about how to worship and what's the right way to practice. Finally, there's another group called Reconstructionist, which is similar to Reform. It's a specifically American Jewish movement, and like Reform Judaism, the goal is to make Jewish ideas relevant to the modern world. So those are just some of the different groups and kind of divisions within Judaism. A key idea to remember when we're talking about Judaism that you should keep in mind throughout this chapter, and it makes Judaism different from most religions. All of the other religions we've talked about, I think, pretty much exist just as a religion, wherever they might have had their roots. You know, if you practice that religion, you believe its beliefs, you identify as it. But Judaism is a little more complicated because of this history of having once had this homeland and then being exiled from it and carrying on their culture and traditions, and often, you know, only intermarrying with other Jews for generations and generations. Judaism is a religion, but being Jewish can also be just your cultural identity. So if you're not born Jewish, can you become Jewish? Yes, people from non-Jewish backgrounds can convert. They often convert when they marry Jewish people, for example. But Judaism doesn't seek out and encourage converts the way some religions do. I mean, if you know anything about Christianity, certainly some branches of Christianity are always very eager to try and convert people and, you know, preaching to people and trying to win them into the group. Judaism doesn't really do that. It's kind of like, we are who we are, we have our ways, we have our traditions. If you want to join us, you can, but we're going to put you through a long process of like learning and study and trying to find out if that's what you really want. They don't encourage conversion the way some other religions do. But also important to remember, there are a lot of people, this is especially true today, but it was true throughout the 20th century and in the 19th century. There are a lot of people who come from Jewish families, who have a Jewish heritage and cultural background, but are not particularly religious. Some of them may even be atheists. They may not believe in God at all, much less want to, you know, go to the synagogue or worship or observe any of the Jewish holy days. But being Jewish is still a really important part of their cultural identity, part of how they identify. So kind of the same way it's important to us to identify as Newfoundlanders, for many of us. For many Jewish people, it's important to identify as Jews and say, that's my culture, that's who I come from, those are the people that make up my heritage, even though they may not be particularly religious. And so people like this would identify as Jewish and say, yes, I'm Jewish, even though they don't practice the religion of Judaism. That's an important kind of distinction to keep in mind, that if a person says that they're Jewish, that might be referring to their religious beliefs, but it also might just be referring to their cultural heritage and background.